You're listening to Media Savvy Moms with Melody and Marilyn, a podcast by Parents Aware, your go-to for information on how to talk to kids and teens about pornography and healthy sexuality.
Welcome back to Media Savvy Moms. Today is a Q&A episode, so a short episode where we answer questions from our listeners. And if you have a question, please submit it to admin@parentsaware.info or any of our social media platforms. We will find them and we would love to answer it on the show. So today's question is, there is so much about racism in the media right now. My son approached me the other day and wanted to know what it's all about. Do you have any advice for talking to my kids about this touchy subject? Melody.
Oh, this is a touchy subject and it's very real. And I'm curious, Marilyn, as we get into this conversation to see how it's crossing over borders. But here, I live in Richmond, Virginia, and it's very real, very poignant. We've had riots in our downtown, and we've driven through where places have been burned and all sorts of destruction has happened. And so we're here to talk about navigating a media saturated world. So a lot of you are getting this through the media, but some are getting it in real life too. So this is a very valid discussion right now to be having with our kids about media and things happening in real life. My advice is to use stories and real life experiences when you're talking to your kids, because instead of being ambiguous and, hey, we should talk about and we should learn about, if you really are able to use some storytelling when you're talking to your kids, they will remember. I personally, I'm from a Latino family, and so not to put what's going on in the world at all in the same sphere with what's happening right now, but I grew up in the Deep South. We grew up in a near an active branch of the KKK, and we were afraid. They used to stand on the street corner in hoods handing out their pamphlets. And so we've seen racism very, very full in the face. I had an uncle who used to be beat up at school because of his race. I had girls who teased me at girls' camp about the color of my skin. When you're teaching your kids about racism, if you have these kinds of things in your pocket where you've had personal, close experiences, maybe not necessarily about you, somewhere in your family, some of your friends, if you've witnessed acts of racism, how did it make you feel? Think about these things before you talk to your children. If you have that kind of passion and those kind of personal emotions when you're connecting with your kids, I think it'll make the discussion a lot more relevant to them and mean a lot more. What about you, Mare?
A really good idea. And I love that you make it personal. For me, you asked the question, has it affected us here in Canada? And I would say personally, yes. I mean, you can't, I'm not sure when this show will air, but at this time, we are all impacted by what's happening in the news, and it can be overwhelming. Now, I would say that where we live, we are outside of a city center. We live in a very multicultural part of the world. Toronto is one of the most multicultural cities. Does not mean that racism does not exist. It is everywhere. And certainly people close to me, family members, have been impacted by this. But I, who come from a very Anglo-Saxon background, want to know how I can help my kids grow up facing this issue in an appropriate way. And that's a question that I have, and I know that I'm not going to do it perfectly. But because we are removed from it to some degree, unless my kids are watching the news or listening to the news, they don't know about it. So I am actually more intentional about bringing it
Mm.
up at the dinner table and saying, did you know what happened today in the news? Did you know what happened? Um, and and then we have a conversation about it. And I ask them questions. My youngest is 12. And so if you have a 6-year-old, you might ask different questions, but I ask the question, what's the difference between, being anti-racist and not being
Mhm.
racist? And I don't have all the answers. I want you to know that I'm learning, but I do feel strongly that I want my kids to grow up and really be sensitive to what other people might be going through.
Sure. Empathy is huge, right? Empathy is kind of the end goal, when we're talking about racism with our children, to remember we're people, we're all people, whether we're on the
Mhm.
giving end or receiving end of love or racism or hate or all of these things, to teach empathy. And as I was researching this topic and reading some of the different articles, because there are a lot of articles and podcasts and posts with information and advice to parents right now, what stood out to me the most was, it's when it comes to racism, it's not about what you say. Your kids are going to watch you and see what you
Mhm.
do. And this weekend, it was interesting because we went downtown to go to Maymont. It's a park. It's an estate, and there are gardens, and it's gorgeous, and it's huge, and it's a really fun hotspot outside. And so during COVID, a lot of people were there this weekend. And in Richmond, we have, oh, there's so much beautiful color everywhere. And I loved that we were all just families. We were all just families kicking it in the park. I didn't see any aggression or hate or dirty looks. If anything, I saw love, and we were walking around. There was a graduation going on. We were, I'm sorry, we were congratulating each other and telling each other how beautiful these girls looked in their robes. And I think that that was a way bigger lesson for my son personally on racism than anything that I could have said to him. And then driving through Richmond on the way home to see the graffiti and the boarded up windows and the places that had been burned. And we talked about it on the way home, the contrast between what we had experienced in the park and what we saw in the city, and how people can't control how we act to each other, even though there was all of this um, mess going on in the city. We still had the power to go into the park and to love each other and to be together, just people, just families.
Yeah, that's the way it should be. I had a thought. When I saw this question, I thought there's what's happening now, but the question is about media. Like what happens when you see racism in the media? So there's racism in the media that's happening right now, but I also thought of, we go back to some of our favorite, you know, or what beloved
Hmm.
movies of the past. And things we see are really culturally insensitive
Yes,
today
absolutely.
that we did not pay attention to a decade or two ago. And so, and a different take on that question is to, yes, show in your behavior how we should treat people, but also call it out when you see it. If you're watching something with your kids, say a movie from the 80s, I think Common Sense Media did a list of some of these favorite movies that many people love, and you will notice that they're not culturally sensitive. So call it out and have that conversation. One thing that I do notice having older kids is that when they go to high school, there's a lot of joking around and they're like, "Oh, it's all in fun,
Mm,
mom." And it can be people of color that joke with one another, but for me, it's never okay to have racial
mm.
jokes. Like there's and I'm going to define that line for my kids. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. All right. So we have a resource for you. In addition to, I like that. I didn't know about that list from Common Sense Media. We'll see if we can find that and link to that for you guys. We also have Conversations with My Kids, book from Educate and Empower Kids, which actually I'm a co-author on.
This is one of my favorite books to get those conversations started. And they're not all tricky conversations, but it's just a great way to have meaningful
Yeah, it's
conversations with
great.
your
Like
kids.
bring
I
it
love that book.
to the dinner table, right? So
Uh-huh.
lesson 8 on page 26 is racism and tolerance. And there's an intro and some questions and some activities you can do on racism and tolerance. And on page 43, lesson 14 is getting along and standing up for others. So those are 2 great lessons from the book, Conversations with My Kids. So we'll link to that in the show notes. And what's our quote for the day here?
This is a fun quote for a tricky topic. Racism isn't born, folks, it's taught. I have a 2-year-old son. You know what he hates? He hates naps. End of list. And that's a quote by Dennis Leary.
We're all parents. We all get that. It's true. All right. So we also have a challenge for you. We'd love for you to take a little time with your kids this week and research the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. and have a discussion with your kids about it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Media Savvy Moms podcast. For detailed show notes and links to any of the resources mentioned today, visit parentsaware.info. To connect with us on social media, find us on Instagram at Media Savvy Moms and on Facebook and Twitter at Parents Aware. We would love to get your feedback. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast. Until next week, let's keep talking.